Hello and welcome to Watercooler, brought to you by the Menzies Research Centre in Sydney. I'm Nick Cater, Executive Director of the Menzies Research Centre. Claire Lehmann is an Australian psychology graduate and an entrepreneur in free speech. The online magazine she started 6 years ago, Quillette, is a haven for intelligent free thinkers. It's a magazine that pushes against the boundaries of left-wing orthodoxy, a forum for the kind of opinions that would get you into trouble if you tried to publish them elsewhere, or so it's said. Claire, welcome to Watercooler. It's terrific to have you. I've admired your stuff for a long time, but it's the first time we've had a chance to have you on. Welcome.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Now, Claire, I was taught that it was the height of bad manners to talk about a woman's age, but I don't know really what the rules are these days around that. So here, let's come straight out with it. You're in your mid-30s, which classifies you as a millennial.
Yes.
Millennials in the mind of older generations like myself are seen as self-absorbed, moralizing narcissists, willfully ignorant of their own history and tradition, dogmatic and wrong about almost everything. You, on the other hand, are completely the opposite. You're none of those things. So my question is, have I got the stereotype wrong, or are you just a misfit?
That's an interesting question. I actually haven't been asked that before. I suppose I would qualify as an elder millennial, but and many of the generational changes I see in people younger than myself. So people in university now, in their early 20s. I think there's a lot of variation in people my age and people in their 30s, and that might have to do with where they come from, where they grew up, whether or not they're parents, whether or not they're able to own any property. I mean, there's a lot of variation in responsibilities that people in their 30s have, and potentially one mark of difference or one point of difference is that I haven't had a sort of private school middle class upbringing. I come from Port Adelaide in South Australia, which is of quite working class and quite blue collar. So that might give me a little bit of point of difference from some of the other millennials that you're stereotyping.
Well, allow me to be bold enough to summarise your early life. You grew up in Adelaide, as you said, Port Adelaide, daughter of an artist and a childcare worker, I think I read.
Speech pathologist.
Okay, well, as a variation on that, you studied psychology and English at Adelaide University, where you first encountered post-structural theory, which in one interview I read you decided in a very early age was bullshit. Was that the radicalizing moment in your life, do you think, or was there something else?
Yeah, politicizing moment. I definitely, I remember being at university, being quite young in my undergraduate days and being tasked with reading a lot of Michel Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze-Guattari, and just thinking it was nonsense. Not just the philosophy, but how the academics almost worshipped these philosophers and weren't, prescribing any readings that would debate their philosophical points of view. It was all very much one-sided, like a one-sided kind of presentation of a epistemological framework. And it just didn't seem, I remember coming to a point where I thought, this is indoctrination, this is not education. And that would have been in the early 2000s. And so even though I had a passionate interest in literature, I switched to psychology because I thought, a scientific framework is going to be more oriented towards truth seeking than what I'm experiencing in the humanities. And it was.
Yeah, of course now, I mean, let's fast forward 10, 15 years, that virus, as I call it, that was infecting intellectual thought in universities is now leaked out of the lab and it's infecting all public thought, isn't it? I mean, you know very well Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's recent book cynical theories, which sets this out in clear detail, how, corporations are now buying into this, what we call woke. Did you ever think it would happen that way?
Oh, I didn't. Honestly, I didn't. And I first noticed that this way of thinking, this ideological way, this ideological framework becoming more and more popular when it leaked into mainstream media in the press. So I remember before I started Quillette, reading more columns in the sort of left-leaning media that were colored by this kind of post-structural lens. And I thought, this is bad, this is dangerous. And little did I know that it would just explode into the culture in a matter of years. I think thanks to the power of the internet and social media in particular, in being able to spread these ideas, like you said, like a virus.
So let's move on. Your story. You complete your undergraduate course. I think you start a postgraduate course in psychology. You don't finish it because you find something else that interests you. You pick up the story.
Yeah, well, I started a family. I got married and had a baby back in 2013, and I now have a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, soon to be 8 and 5 years old. And I suppose as a young woman trying to figure out both the realities of having a career and having a family, I did a lot of thinking about gender and about feminism and about the trade-offs that one has to consider. And it more and more it led me to believe that a lot of feminist rhetoric is simplistic and not always in women's best interests. Because I suppose as a young woman, I saw the reality that these trade-offs are very difficult, and I realized that a lot of the narratives that I had been exposed to prior to my 20s or prior to my mid to late 20s simplified these choices, and it made me question what I had, the conventional wisdom that I had heretofore received.
Yeah, I might just pick up on that, the feminism. I suppose the number one question is, do you describe yourself as a feminist? Are you comfortable with that? And if so, what do you mean by feminist?
Yeah, I would definitely describe myself as a feminist if it's defined as a stance where we want to promote equal opportunity for women. I think that society needs women to be able to, achieve great things if they want to. But I'm definitely not a feminist if the definition is that we need to have complete parity in every domain of society. We need to have 50-50 men and women in every domain of society. I think that's utopian and completely at odds with human nature. And so I also think it's quite dangerous because so I believe that men and women are biologically and psychologically different, and the differences can be quite small in many areas, but cumulatively they can become quite large if you add them up. And so trying to shoehorn in women into occupations or preferences that they're not naturally inclined to want to go into, or vice versa, doing the same for men, I think is coercive and does not lead to the best outcomes for individuals and for society as well.
So I'd call that a liberal feminism, and that is based on Robert Menzies articulated this very well in the 1940s, that it was a case that if we believe as liberals in equal opportunity, everybody deserves equal respect and an equal chance to have a go in life, then of course there's no realm of life from which women should be barred. But that's quite different, isn't it, from this quotas idea that people have come up with?
Yeah, I think one of the most dangerous viewpoints of on the left is this idea that human beings or individuals are interchangeable, and that we don't have our own preferences, our own personalities, our own desires. And this idea that we're interchangeable and that groups are interchangeable is very dangerous. And it's been something that I've noticed for quite some time, for many years. And it's one thing that worries me about leftist discourse, because I don't see it de-escalating. I feel it seems as though this concept that human beings are all the same, and I don't mean, of course, we're all the same in terms of our dignity and our moral worth, but we're not the same when it comes to things like our preferences and our personalities. I don't see this de-escalating despite the mountains of scientific evidence that shows that individuals differ.
Well, Claire, we might come back to all those issues of identity politics and so forth in a moment. But first, we should fill people in who haven't yet been to Quillette for what Quillette is about. You set it up in 2015. It's now an international brand, highly successful. Jonathan Haidt, the American social psychologist, came up with what I thought was a neat description. Quillette is a gathering place for people who love to play with ideas and hate being told there are ideas which they are not supposed to play with. How did this obstreperous child come to be born?
Well, I was spending a lot of time on the internet, and I had linked in with some very interesting individuals through social media, and I was a postgraduate student, but I had to drop out because I couldn't manage my studies with my childcare duties. And I just was aware that there were interesting people who didn't have newspaper columns, who weren't professional writers, but they had interesting things to say. And I saw a gap in the market because I was not a conventional conservative, but I was certainly critical of leftist dogma. And I sort of saw a niche where that area, that ideological niche, was not being filled. And I also thought that there was room for long form commentary, sometimes what you might consider a hybrid of academic publishing and general audience publishing. And I just wanted to play around and have a go. And it surprisingly became quite successful quite quickly. And ever since that early success, I've been trying to catch up. It's been one of those projects that has just hit a nerve. There was an audience for it, and we're just trying to cater to that demand.
Let me delve a bit, if I may, into the philosophy of Claire Lehmann and trying to get a better understanding of your guiding philosophy and perhaps even your politics with a few quick questions. So where do you sit on the political spectrum?
I would call myself a centrist. So I have a hodgepodge of stances. I'm certainly not doctrinaire, center right. I might every now and then agree with the left on some issues, but as I get older, more and more, I just gravitate towards the principles that underpin liberal democracy. So civil debate, open inquiry, and freedom of speech. And I think those are principles that, they're not right wing and they're not left wing. They're just principles that underpin a decent liberal society. So I see myself as definitely centrist, but I support principles that allow for pluralism and democracy more than anything else.
So that, in my book, would make you a liberal thinker, if not a capital L liberal. But one description that I read talking about you when I was researching for this interview was somebody labelled you as a libertarian. How do you feel about that one?
Well, I think it would be accurate in a cultural sense. So I certainly support as much freedom as possible when it comes to freedom of expression. But I probably wouldn't be accurately described as a libertarian when it comes to economics or the market. I mean, I am in favor of a free market, but I think, free markets with a little bit of regulation here and there promote competition, and I wouldn't be as libertarian as your classical American libertarian, for example, when it comes to things like tax. So there might be I think maybe that it's the distinction between a classical liberal of the British kind and the American libertarian, which is a little bit more anarchistic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and so to the C word, conservative. It seems to me that people increasingly on the centre right use it as a noun, as in I am a conservative. But for myself, and I'm interested to hear what you think, I'm more comfortable using it as an adjective. We take a conservative position on things. Following the logic of Edmund Burke, that to throw everything away and start again is a pretty terrible idea. No doubt you get burdened with this word conservative. How do you see it?
Oh, I think true conservatism is very important, and I have many friends who are conservatives, and I respect conservatism a lot, and I would probably sometimes describe myself as a small c conservative, but I suppose I would differ simply because my temperament is quite experimental, and in my personal life I like to I enjoy the arts, and I enjoy ideas of technological sort of improvements, and so I'm more, I think temperamentally I'm less conservative, but I respect conservatism as a political philosophy. And I think that an alliance between conservatives and liberals is very important for democracy, because you do need that balance. You do need very experimental people to push the boundaries, but you also need conservatives to sort of rein that in. And I think having both is essential to a healthy society. And I get very upset when people on the left try and stigmatize conservatives because it's such an essential part of society, to having that balance between liberalism and conservatism.
Let's explore this idea of free speech on the internet. You're a great example of how that can be put to good use, but as you know, there's an increasingly censorious quality to Silicon Valley. In 2017, you published a number of pieces defending James Damore, a Google employee who'd been sacked after a note he wrote to his managers was made public. He wrote the note after attending a diversity program, I think, and he complained that Google's was an ideological echo chamber where some ideas are too sacred to be discussed honestly. Now, I thought the fact that he was sacked for that seems to be firm evidence that he was right, that tech companies are increasingly intolerant and censorious. But tell me what happened after you came out in support of him.
Well, that's a few years ago now, but we were that was a breakthrough moment for us, actually, because we hadn't reached a mass audience before that, and then post publishing. So what we published was the commentary of 4 scientists on the validity and defensibility of James Damore's memo. And the 4 scientists said, look, there may be some flaws in the memo, but overall it's scientifically defensible. None of the evidence he cited was, he cited a lot of evidence, and it was a legitimate argument to make. We had all sorts of attacks after that. As our prominence grew, so did the attacks on us, and so we suffered some trolling attacks that took us down, and so on. But we've since become quite robust and desensitized to all of those attacks on a personal level, and on a technological level. We've got the infrastructure to be able to withstand cyber attacks. At the time, we didn't. But the issue of Silicon Valley that you mentioned, I think sometimes we forget that there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley, and many of them might be censorious, but there's also a culture of libertarianism as well in Silicon Valley, where people are building technologies that will allow us to retain our freedom of speech. Like Bitcoin is an example of that, and different cryptographic tools that people are building are being built to ensure that we have freedom on the net.
Like I'd agree with that. I mean, there's so many exciting developments on the internet and things that are coming out that you say, well, that's fantastic. But I think, Claire, that early on, when back in the days when you still had to log on to the internet, you weren't sort of automatically hooked up 24 hours a day. I think we were really excited because we thought this is fantastic. This is where people are going to connect around the world and broaden the discussion, and this great nirvana of free speech we were entering hasn't worked like that, has it? I mean, on the one hand, you've got these deep silos now between, you go on the internet and being a good environmentalist, it comes up as you put in BP and it comes up as BP's new green challenge. If I go on, I get shares and stocks opportunities, so we're living in different worlds. And Quillette, does Quillette manage to bridge those worlds or not?
Well, because we try to remain non-partisan, we have in many ways bridged the world amongst a certain intellectual class. So you'll find highly educated people on both the left and the right reading us. That doesn't mean we're reaching the activist class who go online and participate in the online mobs that get people fired. So I'm quite proud to say that our audience is quite mixed politically, and we have a lot of independent thinkers, but you would expect that. And I'm quite proud of the fact that we don't just cater to one particular ideological lens. That being said, most of the people who read us are quite well educated, and we're not, we don't have that mass market appeal that say other outlets might have. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we have underestimated how revolutionary the internet is. I mean, you could, even if you just look at the impact the internet has had on legacy media organizations like the New York Times, and how they're becoming more narrower and narrower over time, catering to a specific niche audience. It's quite frightening because we don't know where this will end, and are we all just going to live in this balkanized world where we have our own ideological biases just confirmed back to us, or are we going to live in a shared reality like we used to prior to the internet? We don't know. And that's the big question.
And here's the thing, I call it the dark net, I think, and you're supposed to be queen of it. But this idea, like ABC's Q&A now is getting audiences less than 300,000.
Yeah.
I don't know what you're getting, but a John Anderson webcast podcast might get 1 million. So if he's got the right guest on. So that we're not now bound by this, the old media environment. We can take opportunities, can't we, and jump out and create a world of our own.
Yes, and that's right. And despite the downsides, and there are many downsides of the internet, I would never complain about the internet because I've made a career out of it and I have my own company. And I think that along with the bad comes some wonderful upsides. And I think it's, you know, we still haven't reaped the benefits of being able to connect really open-minded, intelligent people all over the world. I mean, just think about how fast the COVID vaccines were developed. You know, it was, they sequenced the genome of coronavirus in a Chinese lab. They sent it to someone in a lab in the United States, and they developed the Moderna vaccine in a matter of hours. Like, having that kind of connectivity is fabulous for the future of humanity. It's just, it comes with a lot of downsides as well. And we have to sort of figure out how we maximize the upsides and you know, minimize the impact of the downsides.
And challenging the conventional wisdom, which is what you seem to do in your sleep, as far as I can see. But challenging the conventional wisdom is difficult, and often those of us in, you know, the world of opinion pieces are sometimes reluctant to go there. The one that I have written about more recently are the problems that arise from the transgender movement, if you like. And I know you have too. Take me through that. Where do you see, you know, because on the surface, okay, you know, everybody should be allowed to do whatever they want to do, sort of thing. But why does it become a particular problem with transgenderism, do you think?
Yeah, the transgender movement is complex, and there are a range of issues with it. Firstly, I would say that the gender ideology that is promoted by a lot of transgender activists is wrong. Sex in human beings, in Homo sapiens, is binary. You're either born male or female, and the way that sex is defined is not the way you look, and it's not even defined by your genitalia. It's defined by whether you have small gametes or large gametes. Small gametes are sperm, whether you have the capacity to produce sperm. Large gametes are eggs. Now, there are people who are intersex, but they are a very tiny minority. And so many transgender activists promote an ideology which argues that sex in Homo sapiens is not binary, and that it's a spectrum, and that not only is it a spectrum, but that it's fluid. Now, that's just wrong factually. And so as a person trained in you know, a scientific background, it concerns me that something that is factually wrong is becoming more and more mainstream a position that people hold. So that's one issue. The second issue is coercing language. Now, I have no problem with respecting people's preferred pronouns, and I think it's polite and respectful if someone is transgender to refer to them as the pronoun that they wish to be referred to as. But I do have a problem with being compelled to use made-up words that were not words a couple of years ago, were not words 10 years ago. So there are made-up pronouns like ze and z and who knows what else. I mean, there are other pronouns, and I'm not going to use them. There is, you know, our language has to be agreed upon publicly, and I will not be compelled to use made up words. And I am horrified that some Western countries, I know that Canada was one, and Australia may be going down this path, particularly in Victoria, are edging further and further towards compelled speech. So that's another issue. Another issue with the transgender movement is the fact that it seems that there's an explosion in young people identifying as transgender, particularly teenage girls. So we've published a number of articles on this over at Quillette. There's a term called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which describes girls and some boys as well who never expressed feelings of gender dysphoria as little children, but as they have gone into their teenage years and they've found groups or found information online, they've suddenly identified as transgender. And I mean, that wouldn't be a problem if it weren't for the fact that invasive medical treatments are being encouraged that can have long-lasting and deleterious effects. So we're talking about hormone treatment, surgery, and there are examples. I've read testimonies from girls who have gone through hormone treatment, testosterone treatment, and have had double mastectomies, who have later regretted it. And it's just absolutely horrifying. And so that's a concern. So there's many issues. There's the fact that a factually wrong ideology is becoming more and more mainstream, the fact that speech is being compelled, and the fact that this identity seems to be somewhat socially contagious. So yeah, it is, the transgender issue is a real, it's complex, but it is concerning.
The thing is, it's come out of nowhere, hasn't it, Claire? And it's a new thing. I mean, you're right, of course. I mean, the issue of people being intersex or has been something that's been recognised for a long time, right, by psychologists and others. But this is entirely new. It's a much larger phenomena, and as you say, I mean, I think more than 80% of the cases are teenage girls, which is completely against the historic trend, and this late onset, which is new, because before it was apparent from quite a young age if a child was transgender. So, but we're not allowed to debate it. That's the point. It's a brand new phenomenon, and maybe it's something we've only just discovered and it's always been there beneath the surface. But how do we know if we can't discuss it openly?
Yeah, and I think it's a real worry, because, I mean, it's a strange issue, because if you ask, I mean, most people will agree that, look, sex is either binary or bimodal. Most people are either male or female. A reasonable person will agree. But then if they're pressed and, an activist tries to get someone to agree that, well, no, sex is actually a spectrum and you can be all sorts of things in between male and female, people have a really difficult time standing up for what they know to be the truth. And I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, the way so many reasonable people are sort of caving into pressure and denying what they know to be the truth. I think it's very interesting, but also very concerning. And that, but I personally believe that most people are genuinely compassionate towards children who have gender dysphoria, and also adults who have gender dysphoria and would like to live as a different sex than what they were born as. I think most people are compassionate in those circumstances, but and transphobia, I think, is probably quite rare, and there can be more acceptance of transgenderism. But at the same time, this pressure on people to deny what they know is the truth is very worrying, and very it's surprising to me how many people do cave in.
You mentioned Victoria, I think, where the law in many areas is becoming less and less Australian every time the Parliament sits. But on this issue of transgenderism, they recently passed the so-called conversion therapy legislation, which is there to outline so-called gay conversion therapy, which I don't think is anything anybody I've spoken to has come up with any instance of it happening anywhere in the Australian continent in at least the last 100 years. But the real target, of course, is to protect, if you like, transgender people from undue pressure, and it includes the provision that prayer in certain circumstances is a crime. If you pray with somebody, even with their consent, for them to discover that perhaps, you know, they're not transgender after all. That's a crime. Why this intolerance of religion? What intolerance generally?
Well, I think that's actually a secondary. I mean, that's an important point. But transgender activists, it's important that Victorians are aware of this. Transgender activists argue that letting a child wait, that is, not giving them puberty blockers and not giving them treatment that would facilitate a transition from one sex to another, they argue that that is conversion therapy. So the argument is that doing nothing and not letting a child transition is itself conversion therapy, because the child is transgender, and to let the child be his or her natural self is to help them transition. So this is a very dangerous situation, and it's been playing out overseas in the UK and the US. And it blew my mind when I realized that transgender activists were using the term conversion therapy to describe doctors who recommended a wait and see approach. Now, if a wait and see approach is deemed illegal, then children will be given these experimental medical treatments such as puberty blockers, which we don't know the long-term effects of. It's just ghastly, in my opinion, that we're going down this track and that Victoria is even considering this. But this is where we are because people are too afraid to debate the topic.
Well, once again, we have every reason to be grateful for you and to Quillette. Look, the Quillette business model was to take it international. Started in Australia, you very quickly moved international. I get that. I think half your readers are in the United States, I think, or thereabouts.
Mm.
And about, 5% here in Australia?
Yeah.
Look, all right, that's fine. And I appreciate the challenges of a market the size of Australia, but here's my concern. The consequences of this is that the debate becomes increasingly internationalized, and I'm not just picking on you. I mean, this is general, right? And we here get deeply into the politics and culture war of America and Britain, but there are very important differences between us and the United States, for instance, on, say, the issue of racial identity. Because these become blurred. Yes, we here face the challenge of Aboriginal disadvantage, and yes, the US is still reckoning with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, but the moral questions are very differently framed, and the practical challenges are too. By blurring the two, by trying to apply the Black Lives Matter debate here, or even arguing against the Black Lives Matter arguments, to me leads us into dangerous directions and doesn't allow us really to work through our own issues as Australians. Do you agree with that? And if so, what's to be done?
Yes, I definitely agree with that point. And it's worrying how social media is allowing America in particular to export all of its cultural dysfunctions to the rest of the world. I thought it was very worrying, or not worrying. I thought it was, I thought it was scary, in fact, that the Black Lives Matter protests, which were about police treatment of African Americans inside America, spread all over the world, across Europe to Australia. I mean, we have very different cultures on the issue. In the issue of race, we might share language and we might share some other cultural practices. But when it comes to the issue of race, America is its own country with its own history. And I thought it was disturbing that their grievances were exported all over the world. And I think we have to resist that as best we can. And I think it's also insulting to, for example, the Indigenous people who live here and the Indigenous cultures to be conflated with, African Americans who live continents away. I mean, it's flattening and homogenizing culture to lump every culture in together and pretend that all of the grievances and all of the issues that need to be worked out are all the same. I mean, they're quite different. And I think it's insulting to equate Indigenous culture to African American culture and vice versa. I mean, I would be offended if I was an Indigenous person, if I was just, my history was wiped away and I was somehow lumped in an international context. So I think we do have to resist that. I'm not sure how we do that, but it is an artifact of America's cultural power and the ability of these issues, these hot button issues, to be spread so quickly through social media.
I guess and you are contributing to this. It's drawing out more voices in Australia, more thinkers in Australia, and empowering and emboldening them to get out there in the public square and start debating these issues from an Australian perspective, I would have thought.
I think so. And I think also, I mean, there are all sorts of problems at the education level, but there's nothing that can compare to getting a good understanding of your own country's history. And if we speak about our own history more, and history is taught more in our schools, then we will have some kind of immunity to this globalization of culture, which is where we're witnessing at the moment. And we have to preserve our culture. We have to preserve our history, including the bad parts of it. We can't just pretend they didn't happen. But as part of that, we have to recognize that we are our own place in the world and we have our own culture and our own history. I think I'm just so surprised that all of these American issues are being transferred around the world. I noticed that the French have been putting up some kind of resistance, which I think is interesting, and perhaps we can have some leadership from our politicians as well.
I think great irony in that. I mean, it was as you going back to the start of this interview and Derrida and Foucault, it was the French intellectuals that set us along this path, and now they're calling halt.
Yeah, well, I think the French have less of this hero worship towards their philosophers as the Americans do. And they're a little bit more skeptical of post-structuralism and postmodernism now, thankfully, despite exporting it to the world.
Well, look, I'd recommend everybody goes to Quillette, to the to your URL, and looks at what's available. And I noticed actually last night there was a podcast on this very topic on how some of the French thinkers are rebelling against this, and that's on my must listen to list. Look, Claire, thank you for your ideas, your heterodoxy, your injection of intelligent thought, and thank you for your entrepreneurialism. I think it's to be greatly admired. It's been great having you here on Watercooler.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nick. Pleasure.
Thank you.